In Brattleboro, Vermont, Harold Brener, an 84-year-old Korean war hero, is humiliated at Rosy's coffee house for his ragged coat. Unseen by most, he quietly tends to a stray cat, his wife's grave, and a memorial bench carrying memories of sacrifice. A waitress, Amy, captures his photo, unknowingly sparking a chain reaction. Veterans, led by General Robert Vance, uncover Harold's heroic past. A week later, they confront the café with a folded flag and stories of his valor. As the town awakens to his legacy, a reckoning begins. Will Harold finally be seen for who he truly is? If Harold's story moved you, join us in honoring unsung heroes. Like, subscribe, and share to spread their legacies. Comment your own stories of quiet kindness. Every click helps us keep these tales alive. Support our channel and let's ensure no hero is forgotten again. Thank you. The rain fell in a steady, cold drizzle, the kind that seeped into your bones and made every step feel heavier. Harold Brener, 84 years old, moved through the streets of Brattleboro, Vermont, with a quiet resolve that belied his age. His spine was still ramrod straight, a remnant of a soldier's discipline, though his knees ached with arthritis, and his hands trembled faintly when he reached into his worn coat pocket. Inside that pocket was a crumpled $5 bill, all he'd needed for a simple cup of coffee at Rosy's coffee house. But the boy behind the counter, a kid barely out of high school, with a smirk that cut deeper than the rain, had other ideas. "We don't serve beggars in uniform," the kid had said, his voice loud enough to ripple through the chatter of the cafe. He didn't care that every head turned, that the clink of spoons against mugs went silent. He didn't see the way Harold's fingers shook as he held out that bill, or the faint flicker of hurt in the old man's eyes. Harold didn't argue. He never did. He simply nodded, tucked the money back into his coat, and stepped out into the rain. The door jingled shut behind him, and the cafe resumed its hum as if nothing had happened. But something had. Something small, yet heavy, like a stone dropped into still water. Harold hadn't wanted much, just a warm mug to cradle in his hands, a moment to sit and watch the world go by. He hadn't expected the kid to see the medals pinned inside his coat, or the decades of service etched into the lines of his face. He hadn't expected anyone to notice the weight he carried, the memories that clung to him like damp wool. To the kid, he was just an old man in a ragged jacket, not a hero who'd crawled through frozen mud in Korea, saving lives while bullets sang overhead. Not a man who'd held dying boys in his arms, their pulses fading under his bloodied hands. The kid saw none of that, and Harold, with the quiet dignity of someone who'd long stopped expecting recognition, simply walked away. 7 days later, the cafe's morning bustle was interrupted by the low rumble of engines. 5 black SUVs pulled up outside, their polished doors gleaming under the gray Vermont sky. The bell above the door didn't jingle, it swung open with purpose. A 4-star general stepped inside, his presence commanding the room like a sudden gust of wind. His face was stone, his eyes unyielding. He carried a folded American flag, its edges crisp and deliberate, and placed it on the counter where the kid stood frozen. The general's voice was low, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. "You judged a hero by his jacket." 6 words, no more, no less. The silence that followed was deafening. The kid's smirk was gone, replaced by a flush of shame. The customers who'd laughed or looked away a week before now stared at their cups, their own guilt mirrored in the cooling coffee. In that moment, the whole town seemed to hold its breath, finally hearing what it had ignored for too long. Harold's life moved to a rhythm most never noticed. By sunrise, Brattleboro was alive with its quiet routines. Shopkeepers sweeping sidewalks, delivery trucks idling at corners. But Harold was a shadow among them, his steps deliberate, his presence almost ghostly. Each morning he followed the same path, a ritual carved by years of solitude and purpose. His first stop was the alley behind Lindy's Diner, where a scruffy orange tabby named Sarge waited, his green eyes glinting in the dawn. Harold would ease himself down, wincing as his knees protested, and pour a trail of dry cat food from a brown paper bag. His hands moved with care, as if feeding Sarge was a mission as vital as any he'd undertaken in Korea. "Stay warm, soldier," he'd mutter, scratching the cat's ears with a calloused finger. There was no fanfare, No expectation of gratitude, just a moment of connection. Then he'd rise and move on, the bag crinkling as he tucked it into his coat. Next came the cemetery, a short climb up the hill where the gravel crunched under his worn boots. Harold passed the other headstones without a glance, his focus singular. At his wife Alice's grave, he'd pause, his breath catching in his throat. He'd lay a single white carnation on the grass, its petals stark against the earth. "You'd laugh at this weather," he'd say softly, tapping his cane against the ground. "Still say I left the kettle on." The words were a private ritual, a tether to a love that had weathered war and time. In those moments, he could almost hear Alice's laugh, sharp and warm, teasing him about his forgetfulness. The memory was a balm, but it also stung, reminding him of the years they'd lost. He'd stand there a little longer, letting the rain mingle with the ache in his chest, before turning away. Then there was the bench, tucked beneath an ancient elm in Veterans Memorial Park. It was more than just a seat. It was a sanctuary. A brass plaque, green with age, bore his name. Harold Brener, combat medic, Korea. He held the line. Most passers-by never read it, their eyes skimming over the weathered wood as they hurried past. But for Harold, it was a place to sit and breathe. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he'd settle there, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze distant. He carried a small leather notebook, its cover frayed and soft from years of handling. Inside, he wrote names, friends lost in the snow-choked hills of Korea, men whose faces still haunted his dreams. He wrote about the weight of days, the quiet ache of being forgotten. The words were for no one but himself, a way to keep the past from slipping away entirely. Sometimes the memories came unbidden, sharp and relentless. He'd stare at the horizon and suddenly he was 22 again, crawling through the frozen mud near the Chosin Reservoir. The air was thick with gunpowder and screams, the ground slick with blood. His hands, young and steady then, worked frantically to staunch wounds, to hold life in bodies that were slipping away. "Medic!" The cries echoed over the ridge, desperate and unending. There was no time to think, only to act, to drag a boy from Wisconsin to safety, his pulse weak under Harold's fingers. That boy's face, pale, freckled, too young, stayed with him, as did the others. "Doc Brener saved me," they'd said, the ones who made it. "He saved all of us." But the ones who didn't, their voices lingered loudest, whispering in the quiet of his mornings. Across the street at Rosy's coffee house, a waitress named Amy watched him one day. She'd seen him before, same time, same coat, same solitary stride, but she'd never really looked. That morning, something shifted. Maybe it was the way he moved, not hunched or defeated, but with a quiet purpose, like a soldier still on patrol. Maybe it was the mist that clung to him as he walked away, making him seem almost otherworldly. Amy raised her phone and snapped a photo through the window, capturing him mid-step, his silhouette framed by the gray dawn. Later that night, sitting cross-legged on her apartment floor, she opened the photo again. It stirred something deep, a memory of her mother's stories about Grandpa Joe, a Korean war vet who'd carried the same distant look, the same threadbare jacket. There was a weight to Harold's image, a story she didn't know but felt. She texted the photo to her uncle in Vermont. "Uncle Ray, do you know this man? Looks like one of your old vet buddies. I think something happened at the diner this morning." People laughed, didn't sit right with me. Ray was a retired master sergeant, a man who'd spent 30 years in the Army and seen too many faces like Harold's, some lost, some forgotten. His reply came almost instantly, the words heavy with disbelief. "That's Harold Brener. My God, we thought he passed years ago. He was with the 3rd Battalion, Korea. Combat medic, decorated 5 times but never showed up to any ceremonies. He's a legend, Amy." What happened at that diner? In that moment, the ripples from a single act, the kid's careless words, Harold's quiet exit, began to spread. Amy felt a pang of guilt for not speaking up that morning, for not crossing the street to ask Harold's name. Ray felt the weight of years, realizing a man he'd admired had been living in the same town, unnoticed. And Harold, somewhere in the rain-soaked streets, kept moving forward, unaware that his story was finally being heard. The rain fell in a steady, mournful rhythm on the streets of Brattleboro, Vermont, as Amy stared at her phone, her fingers frozen above the screen. A simple message from her Uncle Ray had unraveled something deep within her, a knot of unease tightening in her chest, heavy with questions she couldn't yet articulate. The photo attached to the message was blurry, capturing an elderly man walking alone outside Rosy's café. His faded green field coat clung to his shoulders, damp from the drizzle, his posture unyielding despite the weight of years. One hand was tucked into his pocket, the other clutching what looked like a crumpled $5 bill. Amy's breath caught as she studied the image, her heart pounding with a strange mix of curiosity and dread. Who was this man? And why did her uncle's response, 5 agonizing minutes of silence followed by the cryptic words, "forwarding to Pentagon," feel like the opening of a door long sealed shut? Amy's hands trembled as she set the phone down, her mind racing. She didn't know Harold Brener, the man in the photo, but something about the way her uncle had reacted told her this was no ordinary moment. She felt as though she'd stumbled into a story much larger than herself, one that had been quietly unfolding for decades, hidden in the shadows of memory and honor. The world, it seemed, was about to remember a man it had nearly forgotten. The photo didn't spread like wildfire across social media. It didn't need to. Instead, it moved with a quiet, deliberate purpose through channels few knew existed. Encrypted messages, private forums, and the hushed networks of old soldiers who still carried the weight of their service. These were men and women who remembered the cold steel of a rifle, the acrid sting of gunpowder, and the hollow ache of loss. They didn't trade in hashtags or headlines, but in stories shared over folded flags and challenge coins, in the sacred spaces where gratitude and grief intertwined. The image itself was unremarkable at first glance. An elderly man, his face obscured by the blur of motion and rain, walking with a dignity that belied his tattered appearance. Yet it was this very image that sparked a ripple, then a wave among those who recognized its significance. A man named Reuben Clark, a retired Army medic, had been the one to set it loose. He'd sent the photo to a small group of Korean War veterans with only 2 lines of text. Harold M. Brener, Brattleboro, Vermont, confirmed sighting, treated with disrespect, civilian staff unaware. Those words, stark and unadorned, carried a weight that needed no embellishment. Within hours, the photo reached a secure veterans forum, a digital sanctuary where names held more meaning than ranks, and the stories of the past were kept alive by those who refused to let them fade. The first response came from a man in Minnesota, his words trembling with memory. "That's Doc Brener," he wrote, his fingers likely shaking as he typed. "I watched him wrap a kid's arm in torn fatigues and drag him 3 miles to safety. Thought he was long gone." The man's mind drifted back to a frozen battlefield, the air thick with smoke and screams, where a young medic had knelt beside him, his hands steady despite the chaos. Harold Brener hadn't just saved his life that day. He'd given him a future, a chance to grow old, to hold his grandchildren. The gratitude he felt was a wound that had never fully healed, raw and aching with the knowledge that he'd never thanked the man who made it possible. Another message followed, this time from California. "He saved my uncle at Chosin Reservoir," the writer said, his words heavy with inherited reverence. "Said he carried 2 wounded men over his shoulders while taking fire. I still walk because of him." He never took credit. The man sat in his quiet living room, staring at a faded photo of his uncle, a soldier who'd come home because of Harold's courage. He wondered what his uncle would say now, knowing the medic who'd saved him had been turned away from a café, dismissed like a stranger in a town that owed him so much. Dozens of messages poured in, each one a fragment of a larger mosaic. Harold Brener was a ghost medic, they said, a man who moved like a shadow, never staying in one place long enough to be pinned down, never accepting the medals or praise that others would have worn with pride. "I owe him my life," one wrote, the words a confession of a debt unpaid. "I never got to say thank you," another admitted, the regret cutting deeper than any wound he'd carried from the war. Each story added to the legend of a man who'd stitched soldiers back together with nothing but gauze, morphine, and an unshakable will, then vanished into the anonymity of peacetime. Then came a message that stopped the thread cold. Posted by a user tagged Iron Raven 4, it was written in all caps, a rare breach of the forum's understated decorum. Do not let this stay quiet. The user was General Robert Vance, a man whose name carried the weight of 4 decades in uniform. Vance was not one for sentiment. He'd served in Iraq, Afghanistan, Kosovo, places where the line between life and death was drawn in blood and fire. He'd buried men who died holding that line and honored the living who carried its burden. But when he saw the photo of Harold Brener, dismissed and disrespected in the rain, something broke loose inside him. It wasn't just anger. It was a profound, aching need to set things right. Vance stood in his study, the early morning sun filtering through the blinds, casting slanted shadows across the room. His fingers tapped restlessly against his phone, his jaw tight with resolve. He didn't know Harold Brener personally, but he knew the stories, the whispered tales of a medic who'd defied death to save others, who'd refused glory and chose obscurity instead. Those stories had been passed down at reunions, spoken with a reverence reserved for the rare few who embodied the soul of service. Now, to learn that this man had been humiliated, turned away like a vagrant in a small-town café, filled Vance with a quiet fury. He turned to a safe beneath a shelf lined with challenge coins and folded flags, his movements deliberate. Inside was a red leather folder, his quiet orders binder, a relic of a career spent navigating the unspoken duties of honor. He opened it and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "Colonel Dana Wright," he said into the phone, his voice steady but urgent. "Activate the quiet response team." The team wasn't listed in any official records. They weren't for combat or covert operations. They existed for moments like this, when the war didn't end but grew quieter, when the debts of the past demanded repayment. Composed of hand-picked veterans, decorated and discreet, the team included men and women who'd once owed their lives to medics like Harold Brener. They understood that sometimes the greatest battles were fought not with bullets, but with dignity, recognition, and accountability. Vance didn't call the press or issue a public statement. That wasn't Harold's way, and it wasn't his. Instead, he sent a series of encrypted messages, each one a directive cloaked in purpose. Mission: dignity restoration. Target: Sergeant Harold M. Brener, retired, Korean War combat medic. Objective: recognition, accountability, honor. Location: Brattleboro, Vermont. For 7 days, the messages arrived, each one closing with the same haunting refrain: some debts don't expire. Across the nation, men and women felt the weight of those words settle into their bones. They were ordinary people now, insurance adjusters balancing spreadsheets, school teachers grading papers, carpenters wielding hammers, retirees tending gardens. But beneath those civilian skins beat the hearts of soldiers. The call stirred something deep, a loyalty that time hadn't dulled. Bags were packed with quiet resolve. Flights were booked, highways stretched out under tires, and modest motel rooms in sleepy towns filled with guests who carried no weapons, only memories. They didn't wear uniforms, but the way they stood, shoulders squared, eyes scanning every corner, betrayed their past. Their silence spoke louder than words, a shared understanding that needed no explanation. They came with reverence, driven by an unshakable conviction. No soldier should ever be forgotten. In Brattleboro, Amy sat at her desk, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through a flood of messages she never imagined she'd receive. Veterans, their voices steady with gratitude, thanked her for shining a light on a man they'd never stopped honoring. Women, their words laced with urgency, asked for updates, desperate to know how they could help. Families of those who'd served under Harold Brener reached out, their emails raw with emotion. "Please tell us when he's honored. We need to be there." Amy's gaze drifted to the window where rain streaked the glass, just as it had the day she snapped that photo. Back then, the rain had felt heavy, oppressive, mirroring the sting of injustice she'd witnessed. Now it was different. The air crackled with anticipation, as if the world itself sensed something gathering on the horizon. Not a storm of chaos, but one of reckoning, of justice long overdue. Somewhere out there, a quiet army was converging, their footsteps soft but resolute. And Harold Brener, whether he realized it or not, was about to be remembered, not as a frail figure in a tattered coat, but as a name that still commanded respect. A legacy that stirred the bravest to stand taller, a hero a nation had nearly let slip into shadow. But not anymore. It was a Saturday morning in Brattleboro, the kind that unfolded with unhurried ease. At Rosy's coffee house on Main Street, the air was thick with the warm scent of freshly ground coffee and cinnamon scones, a comforting embrace against the gray drizzle outside. Soft jazz hummed from the speakers, weaving through the low murmur of conversations about rising gas prices and the chance of more rain. The clink of mugs against saucers set a gentle rhythm, a soundtrack to the town's sleepy weekend rituals. Behind the counter, Chad, a lanky 20-something barista in a faded college hoodie, leaned against the espresso machine, his earbuds dangling like an afterthought. His thumb flicked lazily across his phone screen, oblivious to the handful of customers waiting with the patience of regulars used to his distracted pace. A few tables held familiar faces, locals trading small talk, their voices blending into the cozy hum of the cafe. Amy had just clocked in, her fingers deftly tying her apron as her eyes flicked to the window, a habit born of quiet observation. She always looked for him, Harold Brener, the old man whose absence today left a faint ache in her chest. He hadn't come, not this morning, but someone else did. At exactly 8:13 a.m., the ordinary rhythm of the cafe fractured. A low rumble rolled in, not from within the shop, but from the street beyond. A sound too deliberate, too synchronized to be dismissed as passing traffic. Amy's head snapped toward the window. 5 black SUVs rounded the corner, moving with the precision of a military convoy. They didn't speed or flash lights. They simply glided into place, parking nose to tail in front of Rosy's as if the space had been reserved for them alone. The world outside seemed to pause. A jogger froze mid-stride, her breath visible in the damp air. Across the street, a woman clutching a to-go cup lowered it, her eyes wide with curiosity. Inside the cafe, the jazz played on, but the air grew taut, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Chad glanced up, his casual slouch abandoned as he sensed the shift. Amy's pulse quickened, her breath shallow, her eyes locked on the vehicles. Then the lead SUV's door swung open, and a man stepped out. Tall and imposing, he wore a gray overcoat that hung with quiet authority, his black gloves and polished boots catching the faint light. His face was weathered, square-jawed, unforgettable, a faint scar tracing his temple beneath silver hair. General Robert V. His name whispered through Amy's mind, though she couldn't place how she knew it. 8 others emerged behind him, men and women, young and old, all in plain clothes. But their movements betrayed them. The way they fanned out with purpose, the stillness in their gazes, the unspoken coordination that marked them as soldiers, even now. The cafe's bell jingled softly as V entered, but the sound seemed to echo in the silence that followed. He didn't speak at first. His presence alone cut through the room, sharp and unyielding, like a blade drawn in a sacred space. Chad blinked, his voice stumbling. Can I help you? V approached the counter with measured steps, his eyes never wavering. From within his coat, he withdrew 2 items. An American flag, folded tightly into a perfect triangle, its folds worn but pristine, and a small, weathered combat medic badge, its edges dulled by time but gleaming with pride. He placed them on the counter with a reverence that made Amy's breath catch. "This man came here for coffee," V said, his voice low but resonant, each word deliberate. He was turned away because of an old coat. He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. But that coat was stitched together with sacrifice. The cafe was a frozen snapshot. Customers exchanged uneasy glances, the jazz a faint hum. Amy stepped back, her heart pounding as she watched. Every gesture, every glance. V continued, his voice steady but laced with quiet fire. "His name is Harold Brener, combat medic, Korean War." The words landed like a thunder, heavy with a history the room couldn't fully comprehend but felt in the stillness. Amy's mind raced, piecing together the fragments, the photo she'd taken, the messages, the man whose quiet dignity had sparked something unstoppable. Outside, the rain fell harder, but inside Rosy's, a different kind of storm was gathering. One of recognition, of honor, of a debt a nation was finally beginning to repay. In the biting cold of a sub-zero nightmare, where bullets ripped through the air like vengeful spirits, he moved with a courage that defied the chaos. Unarmed, save for a roll of gauze and an unyielding resolve, he walked through fire, his heart pounding with purpose, each step a testament to a life dedicated to saving others. The weight of those moments clung to him, not as a burden, but as a quiet badge of honor, one he never spoke of. When he turned, his words filled the room, steady and deliberate, cutting through the hum of the cafe like a blade through fog. They had judged him by his threadbare jacket, his unassuming presence, never pausing to consider the weight of what he carried within, stories of sacrifice, of lives pulled back from the edge. A woman in her 60s, her silver hair cropped close, stepped forward, her movements deliberate, as though each step carried the gravity of years. Her eyes, sharp with memory, softened as she placed a worn leather envelope on the counter beside the folded flag, its edges frayed from time. Inside were dozens of faded receipts: coffee, tea, a slice of banana bread, a niche paid in time, each one marked with Amy's looping handwriting. A $2 tip. He held the door, paid for a stranger's coffee on a snowy day, helped Mrs. Dunning with her groceries, his hands steady despite the cold. Amy's breath caught, her chest tightening with a mix of awe and shame. She hadn't known someone had kept these small tokens of kindness, each one a fragment of a life she'd only glimpsed. Another veteran, a tall man whose limp told stories of battles long past, stepped forward, his face etched with quiet pride. "He changed my tire on Route 9, he said, his voice low but steady, like a river carving through stone. Middle of nowhere, freezing night. My kid was in the car, scared and shivering. He refused my money, just smiled and told me to get her home safe." His words hung in the air, heavy with gratitude, as his eyes glistened with the memory of that fleeting moment of grace. From the corner booth, a woman rose, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "Every Memorial Day I'd find flowers on my husband's grave," she said, her voice soft but clear, each word laced with a tender ache. "I thought it was the groundskeeper. I never imagined it was him." Her gaze drifted to the flag and her lips quivered as she realized the depth of his silent devotion. One by one, voices rose in the cafe, not loud or angry, but filled with a quiet reverence, each story weaving a tapestry of a man who had moved through their lives like a ghost, leaving only kindness in his wake. The cafe, once a place of clinking cups and casual chatter, transformed into a sacred space, a reckoning of hearts and histories. Vance, the general, turned to Chad, the barista, whose hands now shook as he stood behind the counter, his earlier judgment exposed like an open wound. "You didn't know who he was," Vance said, his voice gentle but unyielding, cutting through the younger man's defenses. "But the truth is, you never asked." Chad's mouth opened, then closed, his eyes darting away, unable to meet the weight of the truth. Vance's gaze softened as he turned to Amy, his voice a warm contrast to the steel of his earlier words. "You started this," he said. "You saw what others missed." Amy's throat tightened, her eyes brimming with tears she fought to hold back. She could only nod, overwhelmed by the realization that she had unknowingly sparked this moment of revelation. With a single nod to the others, Vance stepped back, his presence commanding yet humble. As he moved toward the door, he paused, his eyes lingering on the folded flag, its stars and stripes a silent witness unto the stories shared. "Some uniforms you wear once," he said, his voice ringing with the weight of a command, "and some, like Harold's, you wear for life." Then they were gone, the door closing softly behind them, leaving a silence that pressed down on the cafe like a heavy snowfall. The quiet lingered, thick and profound, not empty but brimming with the weight of years of unspoken gratitude, of lives touched by a man who asked for nothing. Then, from a corner by the window, Mrs. Carty, a widowed teacher in her 90s, rose slowly, her frail frame steady with purpose. Her voice, trembling but resolute, broke the silence. "That man, Harold," she said, "brought me firewood during the blizzard of '06. I was too proud to ask for help, too stubborn to admit I was cold. He didn't knock, didn't wait for thanks, just left it stacked neatly by my door. Her words floated like a prayer, delicate yet powerful, stirring the air with their sincerity. Another voice joined, this one from a booth near the front. A middle-aged father in a flannel jacket leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly as he spoke. My car broke down on Route 14 years ago in the dead of winter. My daughter was in the back seat, shivering, her breath fogging up the windows. No cell service, no help in sight. I thought we were done for. Then this old man in a rusted pickup pulls up, hands me his only blanket, and stays until we were warm enough to wait for a tow. Wouldn't even take gas money. His voice cracked, the memory of that freezing night flooding back, his gratitude a living thing in the room. A quiet customer, one Amy recognized only as the man who ordered black tea and read the paper in silence, spoke next. He replaced the porch light on my mother's trailer, he said, his voice steady but laced with wonder. She's blind, and the flickering bulb was confusing her at night. He just showed up with a new one, fixed it without a word. I didn't even know it was him until today. His eyes met Amy's, and she saw the same realization dawning in him that she felt in herself, a quiet awe at the man they'd all overlooked. The stories poured forth, each one a thread in the invisible legacy Harold had woven. He fixed a mailbox after a snowplow knocked it down. He left sandwiches on a park bench every Friday, a quiet offering for those in need, mistaken for the work of a church. He shoveled the steps of the community center before dawn after every storm, his breath visible in the cold air, his work unnoticed until now. Amy stood near the counter, her heart swelling with each tale, her eyes wide with the weight of it all. She'd seen Harold come and go for years, always in that same faded jacket, always quiet, his presence as unremarkable as the morning fog. She'd thought he was just a man of routine, a familiar face in a small town. But he had been building something extraordinary, a legacy of kindness stitched into the very soul of the community, invisible until this moment. Stepping forward, Amy's voice was steady, though her hands trembled with the weight of her words. He never asked for thanks, she said, her eyes scanning the crowd, meeting nods and tear-streaked faces. He never told anyone who he was, but I think it's time he got what he never asked for. The room murmured in agreement, some silent, some weeping softly, all bound by the shared realization of a man who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. In the soft light of late morning, Dale, the stout owner of Rosy's coffee house, emerged from the back room, his weathered face pale, shadowed by a heaviness that went deeper than the grind of running a small-town café. His 60s had carved lines into his brow, but today those lines seemed to deepen with a quiet sorrow. His broad shoulders, once a symbol of his pride in serving his neighbors, sagged under a burden he couldn't name. As he scanned the room, his gaze fell on the familiar faces, locals sipping coffee, chatting softly, their lives intertwined with his own. These were his people, his community, and yet a cold tide of shame washed over him, chilling his core. He'd failed them, failed someone they all should have remembered, though the shape of that failure was still forming in his mind. His eyes drifted to the front window, where a tattered "Help Wanted" sign had hung for weeks, its corners curling like a forgotten promise. With slow, heavy steps, he crossed the cafe, the faint clink of cups and murmurs of conversation fading into the background. He reached for the sign, his thick fingers pulling it free with a sharp crackle of tape, each tear a quiet admission of neglect. From his coat, he retrieved a battered notepad and a worn pencil, his hands trembling as he wrote in bold, deliberate letters. He pressed the new sign to the glass with care, its words a solemn vow. Closed today in honor of Sergeant Harold Brener. We forgot. We will not again. No one clapped, no one spoke, but the silence thundered with shared recognition, a moment of reckoning for a truth too long overlooked. I, the young waitress who'd poured Harold's black coffee, no sugar, no cream, for years, felt her heart constrict, a pang of guilt and gratitude mingling within her. She moved toward the corner table, Harold's table, her steps soft but resolute, as if drawn by an unspoken duty. In her hands, she carried a fresh cup of coffee, its steam curling upward like a prayer. She set it down with reverence, her fingertips grazing the table's worn surface, a place that held years of quiet mornings and fleeting exchanges. Beside the cup, she placed a single white carnation, its petals fragile yet resolute, a silent offering for a man who'd given his all, his courage, his years, his peace, without ever asking for recognition. Her eyes shimmered, not with tear, but with a fierce determination to honor him, to ensure his memory lived on. Outside, the gray clouds that had shrouded the town began to break, and sunlight spilled across Main Street, casting a warm, golden glow that felt like absolution. Rosy's coffee house, once just a stop for eggs and espressos, had become something more, a place of memory, a space where a community confronted its own quiet failures and pledged to remember. That afternoon, a group of veterans returned, not in polished uniforms or gleaming SUVs, but as neighbors, their arrival marked by a quiet dignity. They gathered at Harold's table, ordering black coffee, no sugar, no cream, each cup a small act of homage. They stayed until the cafe's lights dimmed, their words few but weighted with meaning. Silence bound them, a shared understanding of sacrifice, of battles fought in distant lands and quieter struggles carried home. Amy watched from behind the counter, her gaze lingering on their granite-set shoulders and watchful eyes, always scanning, always ready. Some wore plain jackets, free of patches or pins, but their posture betrayed their past, warriors who recognized their own. They knew Harold not as a name but as a brother, a man whose service echoed in their own. The town, too, was awakening to his legacy. Across the street, near the church, a bulletin board displayed a printed photo of Harold, his coat wrapped tight against the wind as he walked Main Street's familiar path. Below it, a handwritten note declared, "The coat may fade, but honor never does." Those words, stark and true, captured the quiet power of a man whose sacrifice had finally been seen, his legacy no longer hidden in the shadows of this small New England town. As the sun sank behind the maples, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, Harold Brener stepped onto his porch, his movements measured but unwavering. His knees groaned with each step, his back a silent chorus of aches. But his steadiness remained, a relic of a life forged in discipline and duty. In one hand he held a chipped mug of tea, its warmth a small comfort against the cool evening air. In the other, a folded newspaper, unopened, its words too blurry to hold his attention anymore. Colonel the Gray Tabby lounged on the windowsill, her slow blink a quiet greeting as he passed. He paused to scratch behind her ears, a faint smile softening his weathered face. "Quiet day, soldier," he rasped, his voice rough yet tender. "The kind we used to pray for." He settled into his crooked rocking chair, its familiar creak a steady anchor in the fading light. The breeze tugged at his old army coat, its frayed edges whispering of years gone by, of a time when it had nearly cost him entry to Rosy's for looking too worn, too out of place. He didn't know about the sign in the cafe window, or the carnation on his table, or the way a single morning had reshaped the town's heart. He only knew the calm of the wind, the rustle of leaves, and the rare fleeting feeling that he wasn't unseen. Then came the sound, engines low and purposeful, cutting through the evening's hush. 3 black SUVs rolled to a stop along the curb, their sleek surfaces catching the last of the golden light. The engines fell silent together, and the doors opened with deliberate care. Out stepped General Robert Vance, his civilian attire, a simple coat and slacks, doing little to dim the aura of command that had surrounded him, a mantle of leadership worn as naturally as his own skin. His presence carried the weight of battles led, of lives saved and lost, a quiet reverence that needed no insignia. Behind him followed 8 others, veterans of different eras, each marked by their own journey. One wore a leather bomber jacket, its cuffs frayed from years of wear. Another leaned on a cane, his posture unyielding despite the years. No medals gleamed on their chests, no rank was displayed, but their shared purpose shone brighter than any decoration. Vance led them up the short walkway, his eyes fixed on the man in the rocking chair, a soldier whose quiet service had endured even when the world had turned its gaze away. Harold paused at the edge of his porch, his weathered boots scraping softly against the worn wood. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, and a faint breeze stirred the air, carrying the scent of pine from the nearby woods. His hand reached out, almost without thought, to grip the arm of the old rocking chair beside him. It was a familiar motion, one born of years spent steadying himself against the weight of memory and the quiet ache of a life lived in service. His eyes, sharp despite the lines etched around them, caught movement at the end of the drive. A figure approached, deliberate and measured, and Harold's breath hitched, though he couldn't say why. Vance stopped at the base of the porch steps, his silhouette framed against the fading light. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he raised a hand to his brow in a salute so precise, so solemn, it seemed to pull the world into stillness. The gesture was more than formal. It was a bridge across decades, a silent acknowledgement of battles fought, losses endured, and promises kept. It carried the weight of history, older than the flags that flew over courthouses, deeper than the ribbons pinned to chests. Harold froze, his heart stuttering as he met Vance's gaze. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, two men bound by a shared past that needed no words. Harold's throat tightened, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, rough with disbelief. "Never thought anyone would still remember me." Vance lowered his hand slowly, his eyes never leaving Harold's. "We don't forget our own, Sergeant." His voice was steady, but there was a tremor beneath it, a quiet reverence that made the moment feel sacred. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, weathered folder, its edges frayed from years of waiting. He held it out, and Harold took it with hands that trembled not from age, but from the sudden rush of memory. Inside was a commendation, its ink faded but legible, dated 1951 and signed by a general long gone from this world. The words spoke of courage, of sacrifice, of a young man who had stood tall when the world around him burned. Harold stared at the paper, his chest tight with a mix of pride and sorrow. "This should have reached you years ago," Vance said, his voice soft but firm. "Some honors take time, but the ones that matter always find their way home." Harold's eyes lingered on the folder, tracing the creases as if they held the map of his life. A faint smile tugged at his lips, bittersweet and fleeting. "Guess I had better dust off my old boots," he muttered, his voice laced with a humor that masked the depth of his feelings. Vance chuckled, a low, warm sound that broke the tension, and for a moment the two men stood together, veterans bound by an unspoken understanding. Behind them, Amy leaned against the SUV, her arms crossed, her eyes glistening with tears she didn't bother to wipe away. She watched the exchange, her heart swelling with a quiet awe. She had known Harold only as the old man in the threadbare coat, the one who shuffled through Brattleboro's streets with a nod and a smile. Now she saw him as he truly was, a hero, not of storybooks, but of the real gritty kind, the kind who carried their burdens without complaint. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in Brattleboro. Amy, driven by a fire she hadn't known she possessed, threw herself into a new mission. She partnered with the local VFW and support centers, pouring her heart into a program she named Quiet Valor. It started small, a handful of volunteers, a list of veterans' names scribbled on a legal pad, a few trays of donated pastries and pots of coffee. But it grew like a seed taking root in fertile soil. Quiet Valor wasn't just about Harold, though his story was its spark. It was about every man and woman who had served, those who came home to fanfare and those who returned with wounds no one could see. It was about noticing, about remembering, about giving dignity to lives too often overlooked. The first meeting was held in the back room of Rosy's coffee house, a cozy space with mismatched chairs and walls lined with old photos of the town. Dale, the owner, offered the room for free, his gruff exterior hiding a heart that beat for his community. Every Thursday morning at precisely 8 o'clock a.m., a steaming cup of black coffee was placed at table 4, Harold's table. No sugar, no cream, just the way he liked it. Some days Harold showed up, his coat draped over his shoulders, his eyes crinkling with a quiet gratitude. Other days the chair remained empty, but the coffee was always there, a silent promise that his service would never be forgotten. The ritual became a touchstone, a reminder that respect didn't need grand gestures. It lived in the small, steady acts of care. As Quiet Valor grew, the town began to change. Stories surfaced, shared over cups of coffee or in quiet conversations on porches. Locals spoke of other veterans, men and women who had served in wars both famous and forgotten, who had returned to lives of quiet sacrifice. The threadbare coat Harold wore, once a symbol of hardship in the eyes of passersby, became something else entirely. It was a badge of honor, a testament to a life given in service, not just on battlefields, but in the everyday battles of existence. The town responded not with parades or speeches, but with action. Driveways were shoveled clean after snowstorms, no questions asked. Bags of groceries appeared on doorsteps, left by anonymous hands. Letters poured into Congress, demanding better care at the local VA clinic, each one fueled by the memory of Harold's quiet dignity and the lesson he had taught them. To notice, to care, to act. Months later, Amy arrived at Rosy's early one Thursday, her breath fogging in the crisp morning air. She pushed open the door, expecting the usual hum of conversation, but instead found Harold already seated at table 4. He sat with his hands wrapped around the coffee cup, staring into its dark surface as if it held answers to questions he'd never asked aloud. He looked up as she approached, and for a moment neither spoke. Then, in a voice soft but steady, he said, "You gave me back something I didn't even know I'd lost." The words hit Amy like a wave, and she felt her throat tighten. She didn't know what to say, so she simply sat across from him, the silence between them filled with understanding. 2 generations, 2 wars, one of bullets and blood, one of neglect and forgetfulness, bound by a single truth. Service never ends, and neither does respect. Outside, Brattleboro moved on, its streets bustling with the rhythm of daily life. But inside Rosy's at that small table, something sacred lingered. It was a legacy, a final salute that would echo long after Harold's rocking chair on the porch fell silent. Harold Brener hadn't asked to be remembered. He didn't wear his medals or boast of his deeds. He wore his coat, weathered and worn, and for that, he had been judged. But his story was a reminder that dignity isn't found in appearances, that service doesn't end when the guns fall silent, and that honor belongs not in ceremonies, but in the quiet moments when no one's watching. In a world that rushes past, that scrolls and assumes and forgets, Harold's story asked a simple question. How many others are out there, walking among us, carrying their own quiet valor? And more importantly, will we stop long enough to notice? The morning sun filtered through the smudged windows of the small café, casting a warm golden glow across the worn wooden tables. At one of those tables, tucked in the corner, sat a man whose presence seemed to blend into the quiet hum of the place. Harold. He was older, his face etched with lines that told stories he never shared, his hands weathered from years of work most could only guess at. He wore a faded flannel shirt, the kind that looked like it had been washed 1,000 times but still held its shape, and his eyes, a soft gray, carried a weight that made you wonder what he'd seen in his long life. Every Thursday morning, without fail, he'd sit there, a black coffee steaming in front of him, untouched for the first few minutes as he stared out the window. It wasn't the kind of stare that looked for anything in particular, just one that seemed to hold the world at a distance, like he was carrying something too heavy to let it get too close. To the waitstaff, Harold was a fixture, like the creaky floorboards or the chipped mugs they never got around to replacing. But to one young server, Ellie, he was something more. Ellie was barely 20, still figuring out who she was, let alone what she wanted from a world that felt too big and too cold most days. She'd moved to this small town a year ago, running from a past she didn't talk about, hoping the quiet would drown out the noise in her head. It hadn't, not really, but serving coffee and eggs to strangers gave her something to do while she tried to piece herself back together. Harold, though, he caught her attention from the start. Not because he said much, he didn't. His orders were always the same. Black coffee, no cream, no sugar, and a nod of thanks when she set it down. But there was something about the way he carried himself, a kind of stillness that felt deliberate, like he'd learned how to move through the world without leaving ripples. Ellie noticed the little things about Harold, the things most people missed, like how he always left an extra dollar under his saucer, even though the coffee was only $2, or how he'd hold the door for anyone who walked in behind him. No matter how rushed they seemed, his face never betraying impatience. Once, she saw him pick up a crumpled newspaper from the floor and fold it neatly back onto the rack, even though no one was watching. These acts weren't loud or showy, but they stuck with her, burrowing into her thoughts long after her shift ended. In a world that felt like it was always shouting, Harold's quiet kindness was a whisper she couldn't ignore. It made her wonder who he was, really, beneath the surface of his routine. Had he always been this way? Or had life carved him into this shape, teaching him to offer small pieces of himself to a world that rarely noticed? One Thursday, as Ellie poured his coffee, her hands shook a little. It had been a rough week. Her landlord had raised the rent, her car was making a noise she couldn't afford to fix, and the loneliness that followed her everywhere was heavier than usual. She tried to hide it, pasting on the smile she'd perfected for customers, but Harold's eyes met hers, and for a moment, she felt seen. Not just as the girl with the coffee pot, but as someone carrying her own invisible weight. He didn't say anything, didn't ask what was wrong. He just reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, worn notebook, and slid it across the table. "Thought you might like this," he said, his voice low, almost lost in the clatter of the cafe. Ellie opened it later, in the break room, her fingers trembling. Inside were sketches, simple, delicate drawings of birds, trees, and quiet moments, like a child's laughter caught in pencil lines. On the first page, in careful handwriting, was a note. "For the days that feel too heavy, keep going." Ellie's chest tightened as she read it. She didn't know why Harold had given it to her, or what he'd seen in her face that morning. But that small gesture cracked something open inside her. It wasn't just the notebook. It was the fact that someone had noticed her struggling and cared enough to offer something without expecting anything back. She thought about Harold all day, about the way he seemed to move through the world with a kind of grace she didn't understand. Was he lonely too? Did he sit in that cafe every Thursday because it was the only place he felt connected to something? Or was he just someone who'd learned to find meaning in the small things, like a warm cup of coffee or the way the light hit the leaves outside? Weeks passed, and Ellie kept the notebook in her apron pocket, pulling it out when the days felt too long. She started noticing other people like Harold, quiet souls who left their mark in ways most overlooked. The older woman who always tipped in coins but smiled like she was giving you gold. The kid who swept the sidewalk outside the cafe every morning, whistling softly, never asking for praise. These were the people who kept the world turning, she realized. Not with grand gestures, but with steady, unspoken care. And yet, they were the ones the world forgot, their stories fading into the background like the hum of the coffee machine. One Thursday, Harold didn't show up. Ellie waited, her eyes flicking to the door every time it creaked, but his table stayed empty. The next week, same thing. By the third week, a knot of worry had settled in her stomach. She asked around, but no one knew much about him, just that he'd lived alone, kept to himself, and always paid his bills on time. Eventually, she heard from another regular that Harold had passed away quietly in his sleep. The news hit her harder than she expected. She didn't know his last name, didn't know if he had family, or what he'd done before those Thursday mornings. But she grieved him, not just for who he was, but for what he represented. A reminder that even the quietest lives could leave echoes. That night, Ellie sat in her tiny apartment, the notebook open in her lap. She traced the sketches with her fingertips, each one a fragment of a man she'd barely known, but would never forget. She thought about how one small act, his act, had shifted something inside her, making her want to be better, to notice the people around her the way he had. Harold's table at the cafe would be filled by someone else now, someone who'd order their coffee and scroll their phone, unaware of the legacy they were sitting in. But Ellie knew, and as she closed the notebook, she made a promise to herself to carry a little of Harold's quiet strength with her, to leave her own small marks on the world, even if no one ever noticed. The world might forget people like Harold, but Ellie wouldn't. His black coffee, his steady presence, his worn notebook, they were proof that even the smallest lives could cast long shadows. And maybe, just maybe, someone else would walk into a cafe one day, see an empty chair, and feel the weight of a story they'd never know, but that would change them all the same.